In the IT world, virtualization and cloud computing are not synonymous. They're not the same thing. So in other words, in order to have a cloud computing environment, you need to be using virtualization. So yes, cloud computing does depend on virtualization, but the opposite is not true. In other words, if you are using virtualization, let's say you've got a hypervisor that supports running multiple virtual machine guests concurrently, that doesn't mean that you are using cloud computing, at least not unto itself. So let's talk about hypervisors for a second, because this is an important part of cloud computing. Think about in the cloud, where we can quickly deploy virtual machines on the Microsoft Azure platform. Well, there needs to be underlying physical server hardware that allows those virtual machines to be deployed and to run. And so those are called hypervisors. So we have physical hardware running a virtualization type of operating system. That's the hypervisor. And there are two main types, type 1 and type 2. So where the hypervisor hosts virtual machines, otherwise called guests, a type 1 is a bare metal hypervisor. And that means that it is the operating system that runs right on the physical hardware that supports operating system virtualization. Now compare that with the type 2 hypervisor. Type of hypervisor is an app. It's a piece of software that needs to be installed within an existing operating system like Linux, Windows, or the Mac OS. So as you might have guessed, running a type 1 or bare metal hypervisor provides more options and better performance than a type 2 hypervisor does, at least when it's used in the enterprise. There are a number of different types of virtualization. We've just talked about operating system virtualization, where we could deploy a Linux or a virtual machine running Windows in the Azure cloud, and it only takes a few moments to do that. And it runs on physical type 1 hypervisor hardware. Specifically in Microsoft Azure, it's running on Microsoft Hyper-V. But we've also got other types of virtualization, like application virtualization. Application virtualization means that while we can run a specific app on a device, that app is not actually installed on that device. Instead, it's got a virtualized environment where things like, if it's a Windows virtualized app, registry entries and file system files are not written to the real host. Instead, they're in this virtualized environment whereby the app appears to be running and is running in the operating system, but it's just not been installed in it. And so the benefit of this is portability. Now, this is not a container. It sounds like container technology, but application virtualization unto itself isn't. It actually predates or precedes things like Docker containers. We've also got network virtualization seen here in the bottom right. And a term that comes to mind in line with that is software-defined networking, or SDN, which is used extensively in cloud computing. Software-defined networking really means that we provide cloud customers with an easy way to configure virtual network settings and routing tables and so on, rather than have them actually make a connection to the underlying hardware like routers that do that. We provide an easier interface. And of course, there's also desktop virtualization, where an entire user desktop might run on a centralized server that actually runs multiple user desktops concurrently. So the end user then would need a thin client device with not a lot of processing and maybe not even any local storage. They would need network access to the server that hosts the virtual desktops. So there's a lot of types of virtualization that can be used both on premises and in the cloud. So what's the benefit then of virtualization in Microsoft Azure? One is cloud tenant isolation. By allowing customers to provision their own separate virtual machines and Active Directory instances, those serve sort of as security boundaries so that one tenant can't access virtual machines and Active Directory instances that are deployed by other tenants. Virtualization allows for the rapid provisioning of virtual machines. So users can simply make a selection in the Azure portal to deploy a Linux or a Windows virtual machine that perhaps has additional software like SQL Server installed. It happens after just a few clicks, or it can also be managed and deployed programmatically at the command line. So rapid and easy provisioning of virtual machines is one of the great things about using cloud computing in Azure. And a lot of the other services that are available in Azure, whether it comes to big data processing and analytics, or whether we're talking about running databases of any type, or whether we're talking about hosting websites, all of that depends on virtual machines. In some cases, some of these are called managed services, which means that we don't actually specify the virtual machine deployment details, such as when we deploy a SQL Server database in the cloud. Instead, we just focus on the database side, and Azure takes care of the virtualization for us.